What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content that I'm uploading onto my channel, then feel free to subscribe, and you can also offer suggestions on topics and characters and storylines and whatnot that we can have discussions on later on in this channel.
Members of the Rob Corps, I have been reading Captain America for 20 years. I've been reading him since the 90s, and I gotta tell you, Nick Spencer's run is probably the best I've ever read. I mean, some of the stuff that I've seen in here, some of the events that have taken place, the page reveals and so on, a lot of them are just shocking. I mean, granted, Ed Brubaker's reveal of Bucky Barnes' return was insane at the time. I mean, it was one of those things you had to be there, and it was like, it was a talk of the town, like, oh my God, Bucky Barnes is back. It was nuts. It was beautifully done, and it was incredible, but for all the pomp and circumstance of Ed Brubaker's run, I would say that Nick Spencer's is blowing it out of the water. Now, keep in mind, a lot of this comes out of the events of Avengers Standoff, Pleasant Hill, the events of Civil War II. And that's one of the things a lot of people have asked me is what's going on with Steve Rogers right now? How do we square that circle? So I want to go ahead and take a moment with this, and I want to talk about this. Again, we already have videos on Steve Rogers, but everybody's video is someone's first video. So for those of you guys who are familiar with Rogers so far, bear with me for a second because there's a lot of people who aren't. So with Marvel, going into all new, all different Marvel, Steve Rogers was basically still the old man. I mean, that's really what he was. He was the old man of Marvel. He was the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. before the events of Secret Wars. By the time all new, all different Marvel kicked off, he was basically like their field commander, their field liaison for the superhero community on behalf of S.H.I.E.L.D. because he's the core of the superhero community. Everybody always considered it to be that way. Because of that, Steve Rogers, along with, I guess really his uncanny Avengers team and the traditional Avengers team, responded to the events of Avengers Standoff, which, took place in Pleasant Hill. It was basically the revelation that S.H.I.E.L.D. was using, or they were remaking a cosmic cube. What ended up happening during this event, though, there were a lot of things that took place, a lot of things that came out of it, the new run of Thunderbolts, for example, but throughout all the events that were taking place, there was basically Steve Rogers regaining his youth. And the reason why was because Nick Spencer was wanting to move into this next level of storytelling with regards to Hydra Captain America. And so during the events of Pleasant Hill, I guess during the events of Standoff, we ultimately found out that with S.H.I.E.L.D. basically remaking a cosmic cube, the cosmic cube had become sentient just like they always do. It took the form of a little girl, and then Red Skull, or I guess the cosmic cube was attracted to Red Skull just because of the fact that the cube as it had been formed was a fragment of multiple cubes, one of which had been used by the Red Skull. So with his memories being implanted on it, so on and so forth, the cosmic cube traveled to him like a daughter meeting her father for the first time. And the result was that Red Skull used the cube to recreate Captain America's backstory. And so what happened is basically reality has been altered. The history of the universe has been changed so that instead of Steve Rogers being an American who wanted to fight on behalf of America during World War II, instead, Nick Spencer is going through and unfolding his backstory over the course of Captain America, Steve Rogers. Now, of course, one of the things that we learn here in the beginning of all this is that as a Hydra student, within Hydra's training camp, Steve Rogers is really a standout star in terms of his intellect. Physically, he's the same Steve Rogers that we always remember. He's not the most physical guy. He's not the fastest. His asthma is always a problem. He's not the strongest. He's the last guy you would want on the front lines of any conflict. But in terms of his mind, he's such a prominent member of the community that the result is that he's basically moved to become the head of orientation, that when new kids are brought into the Hydra training facility, that Steve Rogers acclimates them to how things function, to how things work. The issue is that because Steve Rogers is really like the weakest of everybody who's there, a lot of the students have gotten really irritated about this. And what happens is Nick Spencer uses this as a platform to kind of jump off in this story and focus on the idea that Steve Rogers has a hidden ally, and that he has this hidden ally because he realizes that you can't do everything on your own. You always have to have somebody in your corner. Now, what this does is this coincides with two things happening at the same time. The first is Steve Rogers and Natasha Romanoff fighting through a prison. We don't know exactly why. All we know is they're basically fighting through a prison, going against different prison guards, so on and so forth. The other half of this is that the Red Skull is basically creating a Hydra army. Now, it's not an army in the traditional sense, like we're going to march through Europe. Instead, what the Red Skull is doing is he's going into countries where the citizens feel disenfranchised, and he's turning them into revolutionaries. And so what he's doing is he's basically having them rise up against their government and try to cast them out. The funny thing about this, though, is that for the Red Skull, he's got a much bigger picture here. In his mind, why have his revolutionaries fight? He can have like S.H.I.E.L.D. fight the battles for him. And so what happens is that in the midst of this major conflict in Sokovia, he basically has several of the general's own guys bring the general into a safe room, and then the Red Skull begins talking to him. Now, what the Red Skull says is that in his mind, yeah, he could have the whole fight take place, because keep in mind, the Red Skull still has the mind of Charles Xavier. And so he basically has Charles Xavier's abilities. Granted, it's not global. Charles Xavier's powers weren't really global. He needed Cerebro for that, but he can still control the mind of anybody he wants to. But what he says here is that for this guy, General Camille, I guess it's Camel, I'm not sure how you would pronounce his name, but essentially what's going to happen is the Red Skull's forces are going to lose. Red Skull is basically going to throw the battle. And the reason for this is because if this general is considered to be or looked at as the one guy who defeated the Red Skull, then S.H.I.E.L.D. will come beating on his door, giving him anything he wants. We'll give you training, we'll give you weapons, we'll give you whatever it is that you want if you can continue taking this fight to these various revolutionaries and basically eliminating the Red Skull for good. And what the Red Skull says is he can in turn use those resources that S.H.I.E.L.D. is going to send over, operate from the shadows in secret, and basically turn the forces of Sokovia into his own and use those against S.H.I.E.L.D. as well as other countries and continue to solidify his own arrangement, his own, I guess, kind of creating this power structure in Europe, very similar to what Adolf Hitler did during World War II. And so the reason why, or at least what we learned, the reason why Steve Rogers and Natasha Romanoff are at this prison is because they're tracking down a guy named General Denz. And General Denz was the guy who ruled Sokovia before General Camille came into power or whatever it is. And so because of that, they're basically bringing that guy to S.H.I.E.L.D. They're bringing General Denz to S.H.I.E.L.D. And what S.H.I.E.L.D.'s going to do is, instead of following what Red Skull thought the S.H.I.E.L.D. was going to do and fund this general that, supposedly defeated the Red Skull, instead, they're going to back Denz. And they're going to have Denz essentially create his own revolutionary force. Now, they don't expect it to succeed, but what it is going to do is it's going to give S.H.I.E.L.D. the ability to gain more intel, to gain a better understanding of what's going on, and to basically force the Red Skull to fight a war on two fronts with the intention of being able to pull it off. Now, switching back to the backstory of Steve Rogers, this is when things get really, really wild because, with these kids that are basically jealous of his position, that consider him to be lame, they ultimately ambush him. And of course, they start beating him up, they start pummeling, but then a kid jumps down from the rafters and starts fighting alongside Steve Rogers. And as I was going through this, I was like, dude, this is mind-blowing. This is absolutely insane. And this little bit coincides with Steve Rogers right now talking to Eric Selvig. What Steve Rogers says is, look, it's important that you're in on everything. It's important that you're in on what's happening. And so it's this backstory and the current events basically leading up to this huge reveal. He says, look, I've kept you in the shadows long enough. I have a secret ally. I have a guy that you don't know about, a guy who's in my corner. And as they continue to go through and as they continue to talk, we end up finding out that with Steve Rogers in his younger days, the ally that came to his aid was not Bucky Barnes like we would expect it to be, like a Hydra version of Bucky Barnes. Instead, it was Helmu Zemo. And so because of that, Zemo is his closest friend, is his ally from when he was younger. And so it's like, I was reading through this and I was like, oh my God, Baron Zemo is his friend. They're allies here. And it absolutely blew me away. I was just like, this is this is insane. Now from here, we pick up with really an invasion of Chitauri, the Chitauri alien race. Now on its surface, this seems totally irrelevant. It seems like it has nothing to do with anything. It has everything to do with everything because this is how Steve Rogers works in the shadows. It's one of these things where he just distances himself and nobody considers or nobody even thinks that Steve Rogers' hand will be caught in the cookie jar. Instead, what happens is you have, Steve Rogers fighting against these guys. You've got Carol Danvers fighting against this invading force. S.H.I.E.L.D. is facing off against them. And then we pick up with a girl named Avril. Now, Avril was a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent during the events of Avengers Standoff, and a lot of these old artifacts that were wildly powerful in the history of Marvel Comics were basically just confined in this museum because it was basically designed to be this place that was half tribute to superheroes, half creating a false life for the various villains to keep them under control. And that's one of the reasons why it was so controversial. And the Cosmic Cube, of course, is basically controlling the environment around them, so they would always believe that what they were seeing was absolutely real. But during Avril's attempt to basically help quell this uprising by the various villains that were being held in Pleasant Hill, she had found the quantum bands. Now, the quantum bands, of course, are the signature item belonging to Quasar and is how he uses his powers. But what the quantum bands do is they tap into what's called, potential energy, or the potential energy of the entire universe, meaning that, if you were in the Marvel universe and you were to throw a baseball, if that baseball was sitting still, it has potential energy. When you throw it, it's got kinetic energy, the energy of movement. The potential energy that ball has is what the quantum bands tap into, essentially. It taps into all the energy that exists, that's potential, that's never actually being used. Now, it does that by way of a different universe, and it gets kind of weird and crazy, but that's the long and short of it. The idea here, though, is that Avril is basically the universe's protector. That's exactly what Quasar was. Quasar was one of several heroes who played the role of protecting the universe. Adam Warlock did that, Captain Universe did that, Captain Marvel did that. It was always their role was to be a universal protector. That was back during the days before Marvel really revamped their cosmology with with Annihilation. Prior to that, it was always just these small stories here and there with these characters who existed out there in the cosmos. Maybe you were reading them, maybe you weren't. But at this point, we jump back to the past again. And the reason why is because we pick up with Steve Rogers and Helmut Zemo. And again, this is wild to see the two of them as friends, but Heinrich Zemo has appeared here, the father of Helmut. Now, the reason why this is significant is because in normal history, Heinrich Zemo was an enemy of Steve Rogers. And Heinrich Zemo was actually the person who was responsible for the explosion of the drone plane or whatever it was that led to Steve Rogers being frozen in ice for 20 years and led to Bucky Barnes, being picked up by the Russians. But following this, the reason why Heinrich Zemo is here is because there's a meeting between Heinrich Zemo, Dr. Fenhoff, the head instructor of the school, as well as the school's recruiter, and Daniel Whitehall. Now keep in mind, Daniel Whitehall, while you guys may remember him from S.H.I.E.L.D., in the comics, he played a much different person. He was very much tied into Hydra, but he was really more of like Hydra's top warrior, their top fighter. But the reason why they're here is because Hydra is looking at like Adolf Hitler, Baron von Strucker, and they're basically saying those are not the guys that we need. Those are not the guys who really represent Hydra's ideas. The person who really represents Hydra's ideas, who really represents the idea of Hydra trying to basically take over the world by way of convincing people that they're superheroes, is Steve Rogers. Steve Rogers is the guy we need because he has all the moral fortitude to lead the world to believe that he's a good guy, when in reality, he's working against its best interests. Now, from here, we basically pick up again with this Chitauri army as it's launching another attack, and we basically have Avril as Quasar go out and just demonstrate her power in the sense that she uses this energy to basically wipe away all these Chitauri soldiers, but it's also this huge riot act that's being read by Steve Rogers to Maria Hill and to Carol Danvers. And the reason for this is because Avril basically abandoned her training in the middle of a discussion with Wendell Vaughn to take off and engage in this fight. And Steve Rogers said, we literally just finished Civil War II. Like, we literally just finished this major Civil War event, and already you guys are trying to harness the power of some young girl so you can use her for your own ends. Why in God's name are you doing this? All you guys are going to do is bring everything down around you. But at this point, we follow Steve Rogers back to his base of operations with Dr. Eric Selvig, and we actually learn that Steve Rogers instigated this whole attack. He's the one that led to the Chitauris invading Earth in the first place. Now, there's a reason why Steve Rogers is doing this. He's got a long game that he's playing right now. And that's why this run is so good, is because it's not like Steve Rogers is doing these small things and each one has a goal. Instead, they may have temporary goals. There's a much bigger picture that he's looking for, and we'll find out what that is at the end of all this. But the way that he was able to get the Chitauri forces to show up here is that because they're basically like a hive, they all have queens. They're like termites, they're like ants. They have queens. And the idea was that Steve Rogers had basically taken some and brought them here to Earth so the Chitauri would show up here on Earth with the intention of trying to get their queen back. And so it was really him just more or less leading them there. But at this point, we pick up with really, the trial of Maria Hill. Now, the trial of Maria Hill is not the most important part of this story. All this really is just her being court-martialed because of the events of Avengers Standoff, the way it was handled, and her basically being ousted as S.H.I.E.L.D.'s director. That's all it really is. She's kicked out from the role of being S.H.I.E.L.D.'s director. Instead, what happens here is we also get a little more backstory with regards to Steve Rogers, with regards to Baron Helmut Zemo. It's really the two of them just kind of growing up, sort of coming into their own. But what we also have here is Maria Hill announcing that she's been a great director, that in the midst of everything that's happened, she's always held the world together. She's held the country together. She's used her intelligence in a way that's always been functional. Not only that, and this is really kind of crazy here, she's very cocky, she's very arrogant in how she conducts herself, as if there's no way this is going to go anywhere but her benefit. She's also basically created what she calls the shield. It's essentially this great big huge giant force field that revolves around the planet Earth that nobody can get in and nobody can get out if it's activated. And so what happens is we jump back to the past with Steve Rogers, and we find out that because of the fact that Daniel Whitehall, because these various members of Hydra look to him as the greatest of them, that their goal is to basically have him infiltrate the United States. And the reason why he's going to infiltrate the United States is because there's a man by the name of Dr. Abraham Erskine who's currently working on a super soldier program. And so at this point, we jump to the US. That's what I love about this. Nick Spencer doesn't waste a whole lot of time giving us these great little opening moments where he immediately catches our attention. And of course, what this does is it gives us kind of like this diary of Steve Rogers as he's writing back to Baron Zemo, as well as some kind of explanations about things that are kind of filling in the gaps between the end of the last issue, the start of this one. But basically, he's been assigned to kill Dr. Abraham Erskine. He's been assigned to poison him. And the idea here is that if the US doesn't have a super soldier program, that, Germany will inevitably win the war. That someone with these super soldier powers, basically like a Captain America, so to speak, would help win the war for the Allied powers. So because of that, Steve Rogers has been tasked and has really come to the realization that Dr. Abraham Erskine always goes to the same diner for breakfast. And so the time eventually comes where he gets a job there and says, all I need is a moment. All I need is a second to basically poison this cup of coffee and get him killed. And so what we do do is we pick up with the fallout of this trial of Maria Hill, and we learn again that she's essentially been ousted. She's been booted out. And so what happens is we have the World Security Council sitting down with Sharon Carter and saying, we think you should be the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. Now, the reason why this is such a huge deal, the reason why this is so significant is because Peggy Carter, at least as has been retconned, the aunt of Sharon Carter, Peggy Carter had a major role in helping to build S.H.I.E.L.D. in the younger days. Back during World War II, she was a freedom fighter, or really fought on the side of the United States alongside Steve Rogers. There was a great big huge history there, not to mention that Sharon Carter herself, Agent 13, has a very lengthy history in fighting alongside S.H.I.E.L.D. She's worked directly alongside Nick Fury back before, he killed the Watcher and then became the Unseen. She's been a major part. And so for the World Security Council, it just makes sense, right? I mean, just promote Sharon Carter to the position of director. The issue with this is that Sharon Carter says, I don't want that role. I do not want to be the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. I don't really feel like I'd be the person best suited for that position. Instead, I think it should go to somebody else. And so what happens is we pick up with Steve Rogers, arriving home, speaking with Sharon, and she says, yeah, they offered me the position to be the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. And of course, there's a huge congratulatory celebration between the two of them. But she says no. I said, I don't want that job. I told them that you should be the director of S.H.I.E.L.D., Steve Rogers. And so when I saw this, it blew my mind because I was like, they're inviting the wolf into the hen house. Like, they're putting a Hydra agent into the position of the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. Not only that, it's the best Hydra agent that's ever existed. And so again, jumping back to the past of Steve Rogers, in his younger days, as he's working in this diner, he begins to sort of have this conversation with Abraham Erskine and Chester Phillips. And this is really, really cool the way it happens because Chester Phillips was originally the military general that was there, that was part of the whole Project Rebirth thing. Abraham Erskine, the scientist behind it. And Nick Spencer plays this out very much the same way in terms of Erskine and Rogers' first encounter, in the sense that Rogers kept being turned down all the time. Eventually, it drew the attention of Erskine, and Erskine asked him, why do you want to fight in this war so bad? And Rogers' response was because it's the right thing to do. It was basically because if you find evil, you have to stamp it out, no matter where you go. And this new backstory that he gets, it's almost identical. It's almost the exact same thing. He wants to be part of something bigger than himself. Now again, this is Steve Rogers, the Hydra agent, playing Abraham Erskine like a fiddle. More so than that, there's a guy who basically comes in and steals the purse of the waitress in the diner, of course with all of her tips inside, and Steve Rogers leaps into action and immediately takes off, tracks this guy down, is able to beat him up. Of course, the guy gets away, but Steve Rogers gets the purse, and Abraham Erskine says, this is it. This is the guy. This is the guy with the moral fortitude, with the courage to be the super soldier that we're looking for as part of Project Rebirth. What an exciting time to be a Steve Rogers fan right now, because it's great to see his character go through changes. It's great to see his character fluctuate. It's great to see new concepts being involved. I mean, it'll come back, eventually he'll go back to being the traditional Captain America that we all know and love, where he fights on behalf of freedom and yada, 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 and all that stuff. The same thing that we've been seeing since his inception. He'll go back to all that. But until he does, it's going to be one hell of a ride, and I am excited to be a part of it. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.